Now to our top story of the day. The former President Jacob Zuma has been found guilty of being in contempt of court by the Constitutional Court. Justice Sisika Mpepe says that it was impossible to conclude anything other than that he deliberately went against the courts. Zuma refused to appear before the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, saying that Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, who is the chairperson of the commission, is biased against him. Now, for more reaction on the story, I'm joined by One SA movement leader, Mr. Mmusi Maimane. Mr. Maimane, a very good afternoon to you. In the statement that you released as One SA, you say that the Constitutional Court has managed to do what the African National Congress as well as the NPA have thus far failed to do. Break that down for us.
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to fellow South Africans. In what is a historic judgment, accountability must always be effected. Everyone is equal under the law, and President Jacob Zuma is such. He's long maintained the fact that he is above the law and that the ANC is above the law. What the Concord did today is that it said, no, all citizens are equal under the law, regardless of who they are. That's the first thing. The second thing is that a judgment against the contempt of court is a very significant judgment in that it affirms the supremacy of the Constitution. It divorces us from a bitter past where a parliamentary constitutional authority was in place, but rather in this instance, the supreme court of the land, the Constitution, and the law of the land is the supreme law of this country. And therefore, I do think it's a significant development in our democracy. Justice must be done. And what remains to be seen is whether that judgment will be given effect to in the next 5 days. Mr. Zuma himself must subject himself to proper court processes and in this instance comply with what the courts do and defend the very Constitution he once swore he will uphold when he was sitting head of state.
You also said, Mr. Maimane, that as One SA you'll be writing to the NPA, to Shamila Batoyi, to fast-track the rest of the charges against the former president. Why is that important for you to do right now?
At this point in time, Mr. Zuma is going to potentially has been found again for being in contempt of court. He also faces 700 charges of corruption, and those charges are just as significant, if not more important. So I think if we're going to talk about accountability, it ought not to be selective. We ought to ensure that the criminal processes are not lagged down. And it would have been ideal that what has been a 15-year case, in contrast to what has been a few months of Mr. Zuma being in contempt of court, should have been expedited. The NPA should have ensured that Mr. Zuma, as he's having his day in court, that prosecution is expedited, so that everybody is held accountable. My principle is not a personal matter against Mr. Zuma. It is about the principle of the rule of law. It's about ensuring that every citizen knows that faced with such difficult issues, the law will take its own supremacy. So I would really maintain in this instance that the NPA needed to have done its job to ensure that Mr. Zuma has a day in court, a verdict is found against him, and if he needs to find whatever sanction that is against him, he needs to be able to face it at the time. And you'll recall, even when I was in Parliament, I'd raised it a number of times that Mr. Zuma stood as accused number one in this instance for different reasons, in that at the head of what became state capture, he was at the forefront, which is the very fundamental reason why today we have this commission of inquiry.
I'd like to ask you this, Mr. Maimane, as a former member of Parliament and also former leader of the official opposition. As far as the rights and privileges that President Jacob Zuma enjoys for being a former president, how are those going to be affected by the judgment that was meted out today?
Well, we certainly know that Parliament needs to be able to establish an ad hoc committee that reviews these. The Constitution only prescribes that an impeached president then loses their benefits, and that Parliament is supposed to enact consistently with the law what the remunerations and benefits of all presidents are, sitting and past. Therefore, it's upon Parliament to be able to now review what it means for Mr. Zuma. He can't have bodyguards in prison as an argument. And so some of these issues need to be put before Parliament, and I think a policy must be put on the table. Because at the end of the day, there are many things that happen that in global countries, in countries all over the world, we've been able to send former prime ministers to prison. And so we need to be able to establish that precedent now. And I think this opportunity is presented to Parliament to be able to review its own remuneration committee's recommendations as to what are the benefits for former presidents. I would argue that the taxpayer, the South African citizen, cannot fund Mr. Zuma's litigation and then equally so fund his own defense for that litigation. So I think they need to be amended and they need to be removed. But Parliament is the only body that can review that whole entire process.
Mr. Mmusi Maimane, we'll leave it at that for this afternoon. Thank you for your time. He is leader of One SA Movement.